Now we're ready to put some of our seeds in the ground, and we want to make little furrows in the ground that we can pull dirt back over to cover the seeds. We want to plant some of the important items that would be staples. We have here potatoes. Usually if we think of staple items that we eat from a vegetable garden, we'll think of potatoes, tomatoes, corn, beans, peas. Then maybe there are other items that we use in salads and things. We have lettuce, radishes. We also have greens. But a good idea, especially if starting for the first time, is don't do too big a diversity of things. Start out small, both in the space and in the number of varieties. Especially if your time is limited because you're trying to establish other things. You've just moved into the country and you're starting out. If you've never tried it before especially, start small and gradually expand as you feel comfortable and feel that you're able to handle what you're doing and you're learning what to do to be efficient. So here we'll put some of the staple items in. Some of the things will grow underground, some of them will grow on top of the ground as far as the parts that we're going to harvest and eat. And then some of them will spread out a lot, some of them will be very compact, so we want to know what the growing habit is of the different things will be, and we want to allow enough room for them to grow. Cabbage, for example, is going to make heads and spread out with leaves pretty broad. We need to allow enough room for that, but radishes would not take much space. They can grow in a much smaller space. Carrots also can grow in a smaller space. So we can put some rows of things closer together. We can plant them closer together in a row. And then other things need to be spread apart quite a bit. Potatoes also grow quite a broad space on top of the ground where their vines will be, so we need to allow more room for them. So we'll start with some of our seeds that we have prepared here. I will emphasize that in our selection of seed, we want to pick seed that we can keep. We can grow and keep some of what we grow for seed for next year. These are called open pollinated varieties. Varieties that are hybrids. Sometimes you can keep the seed and plant the next year, but it will be a different variety. It will not be the same variety as what you grew. A hybrid is a cross of more than one variety. And so if you want to be able to grow the same variety from one year to the next, you need to be sure to get a seed that is open pollinated. It's not absolutely necessary to be real precise, to measure everything off. It's nice to have it neat and orderly, and if you're doing it for the first time, sometimes in order to get the idea of what you're doing, it helps to be able to measure and make things a little more orderly and straight. After you've done it a few times, you kind of know what you're looking for, and you can estimate and approximate and get things pretty good even without necessarily measuring. But we will measure on some of these here so we can keep it fairly organized. Just to demonstrate, we'll start in with one row and we'll put just a little stake. These are just little scraps of wood. They work good for putting in as stakes. We'll put one at that side. And we'll plant first some potatoes. We have here some potatoes that we've harvested. Some of them you can see have a little green on them. Now, potatoes that have green on them have solanine that is developing where the green area is, and that is a chemical or an element that is not good to eat. And you've probably heard you shouldn't eat green potatoes. If you cut all of the green part off and there's no green in the part that remains, those can still be eaten, but oftentimes we just keep the potatoes that have the green on them and we use them to plant. They work fine to plant and grow a new potato plant, which will grow new potatoes. The reason that they have green on them is because sunshine was able to hit the potato. If they're up near the top of the surface of the ground where the sun can hit them, or sometimes they'll even stick out of the ground a little bit, they will turn green. So there are several things that can be done to prevent that, and we will cover that as we go along. And in our first row here, we'll prepare to plant potatoes. If you come across any big clumps like we just did here, it'd be good to cut them up a little bit and pull out any tufts of grass. Now to plant potatoes, we want to put them down in the ground. And a rule of thumb you oftentimes can use, especially with bigger seeds, is 3 times the diameter of the seed below the surface of the ground. So you can see these potatoes are 2 inches or a little bigger. So if we use that rule of thumb, that means we can put these potatoes about 6 inches down into the ground. A good time to plant potatoes is in the early spring, not long before the last expected frost. If you don't know when the last expected frost is going to be, you can ask anybody around that has been gardening for a little while. They usually will know. Or you can contact the Agricultural Extension Service in your county or state. Every state has an agricultural department in the state university system, and in most states that state university agricultural department has an extension office in every county. You can look in the telephone book, or you can ask at the county headquarters how to contact the Agricultural Extension Office. And the agents at the Agricultural Extension Office will have most of the information that you would need about the amount of rainfall per year, the last date for expected frost in the spring, the first time that frost is expected in the fall, the average first frost date. Those kind of things are useful in planning your gardening schedule, and those things can be learned by checking with the Agricultural Extension Office if you don't know where else to get that information. Here in our area in western North Carolina, the last date for frost, or sometimes it's referred to as the spring frost-free date, is it's May 10. May 10. So potatoes can be planted several weeks before that. Some people will start planting their potatoes by the end of March or into early April. Potatoes take several weeks to come up when it's a little cooler, and even when they do come up, if they get a frost on them and it's not a hard frost, it may just nip the top down a little bit, and they're pretty hardy and they'll come back out. So you can get an early start, especially for early potatoes in the season, by planting fairly early when the ground starts warming up and getting dry enough to be able to till and plant something in it. Some crops, such as beans and corn, are more tender, and especially things like peppers and tomatoes. Any frost, any freezing weather will kill them down pretty much. So it's important to wait until the frost-free time, the last frost date, is passed in order to plant those things. Or one other alternative is to plant them shortly before the last frost, but be prepared to cover them if a frost is expected. Potatoes can be planted earlier. There are some crops that are very frost hardy and can tolerate some frost. Things like cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, those things can be planted even several weeks before frost-free date also. So here we'll plant some potatoes. We have a short row because in this bed this time we're planting rows across the bed, and that way we can put in many short rows. We will plant our potatoes about a foot apart. A foot is the minimum distance that you would want to plant the potatoes apart. You could plant them up to 18 inches apart. Our bed is 4 feet wide, so we're going to try to plant 4 potatoes in here to cover the width of the bed. And we have them about 4 or 5 inches deep. And we're going to cover them over, and we'll actually add a little dirt to what we cover over, so we'll have them about 6 inches deep. And it will end up with a little furrowed hill over where the potatoes are planted. Now you can see that there's a little hill there, and this accomplishes several things. Obviously, it marks where the row is pretty conspicuously. It also provides some drainage right over top of where the seeds are planted. In this case, it's potatoes. And it provides more surface area of ground to warm up from the sunshine shining on it, and the warmth will help those seeds or the potatoes here to sprout. On real small seeds, you don't get much of that effect because you don't have much soil that's over them. It's not necessary to put much over them. Many of the small seeds will only be buried 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 an inch deep, so you wouldn't have a noticeable ridge of soil over it. But that's pretty much what you need to do to plant potatoes. Once the potatoes start coming up, they will be coming up where each potato was planted, but oftentimes there will be several stalks or shoots that will show up, and they will get longer and longer. They can grow out 3 or 4 feet long, depending on how much the nutrition in the soil will sustain their growth. And as the potatoes grow, the plant will be growing on top of the soil and spreading out like vines in different directions. The roots will be spreading out under the surface of the ground, and they will be gradually forming potatoes. They will start out very small, and they will get bigger and bigger. If they have a full growing season, they can get very big. We've had potatoes sometimes as big as a canning jar that have been able to grow the full season. And they grow, they're actually just enlargements of the roots. So as they're growing under the ground, we want to come back after the potatoes have come up and they're maybe up a couple inches. We want to come back and we want to hoe just a little bit more dirt from out of the middle of the row up against those potato plants, and that will help cover the roots with more dirt so that we don't have as much likelihood of green potatoes like I showed there at the very beginning. And as you go along, you can hoe some of that dirt up. If there are little weeds getting started, you can chop them off. And you want to be careful not to damage the potato plants, but to hoe dirt around them. You can do that 2 or 3 times as the potatoes are growing. Eventually they're going to be up 16 or 18 inches tall, and they're going to start falling over. But up to that time, you can keep hilling up the dirt a little more and covering over where the potato roots are, and that will help diminish the amount of potatoes that would be exposed to the sun and give you green potatoes. Then another thing that's very helpful for the potatoes, after you've had the opportunity to hoe them a couple times, if you have mulch available, old hay, or even things like grass clippings, anything that will work as mulch, this is not something you're incorporating into the soil as food for the plants at this point, but rather it's a cover you're putting over the soil to help hold moisture in and to help hold the temperature of the soil. Some plants will grow much better if the soil does not get real hot. And so putting that mulch on will help to maintain a little cooler temperature in the soil, as well as to hold the moisture. Now, another major reason for using mulch, one of the reasons that many people use mulch for, is to help keep the weeds from growing. So if you've had a couple hoeings that you've been able to do, after you've done the last hoeing and the weeds have all been either hoed up or chopped off, and you're ready to put down mulch, you can collect and put that mulch underneath and pull it right up next to the plants. And if you have enough mulch so the weeds don't grow through, usually at least 3 or 4 inches of mulch is good. Up to 6 inches or even more is fine. Then there's nothing more you need to do till it's time to go and dig and see how the potatoes are doing. We'll plant a few other things here to show how you would do different kinds of seeds. We have here summer crookneck squash. You can get this both in straight neck or crookneck. Summer squash is something that many people like. Summer squash grows also pretty wide on top of the ground. And the squash is born on the vines as they are growing on top of the ground. Our potatoes are going to be spreading out quite a bit, so we'll allow a couple feet for the potatoes to spread out here. And then the squash will spread out quite a bit also. It can spread out 3 feet in each direction, so we want to allow some space for it. We'll come over here and make another little row for our squash. Now this doesn't have to be as deep as the one for potatoes because the squash seeds are much smaller. Here you can see what the squash seeds are like. The squash seeds can be planted maybe 2 or 3 in a spot. We'll just plant 2 places of squash here. We'll put 3 seeds in each place. The reason for putting 3 seeds is because sometimes seeds don't all germinate. That is, they don't all sprout. And so by putting them a little thicker than we expect them to grow, we can allow for the possibility that some won't sprout. We can come back after the seeds do sprout and come through the soil, and we can thin them out and leave just the strongest ones. This gives us the option also to select. If some are much weaker and look more stunted, we can eliminate them and keep just the strongest ones. Then, since these are much smaller, we'll just pull 1 inch to 1.5 inches of soil over them. We can do that easily by hand. If there's any clods, we can break them up. And then a good idea when planting smaller seeds like this is to tamp it down a little bit, either with your foot or with the hoe that you're using. This actually helps the moisture to stay close to the top of the ground. When the soil is real loose like this, the moisture that's in the top inch or two of soil will evaporate much more quickly out of the soil. But if you tamp it down, it'll stay moist longer, and that will help the seeds to sprout there. It's not absolutely necessary, but I've found through a number of years of trying different things that the seeds will sprout faster if I tamp the soil down like that. If I'm doing a long row, such as out in the field, I can just walk along 1 foot behind the other right down the row and pack it down by walking on it like that. There are several other methods if you expect a lot of dry weather, which we will demonstrate a little later, that you can use to help the seeds sprout more quickly also. So there's some summer squash. Then we'll try planting some beans. There are many different kinds of beans. These are just some bean seeds that were kept from beans that were homegrown. Cornfield beans, they were called. You can see here what they look like as they're dried. These are not big. Some are bigger, some are smaller. These will make a string bean type of bean that can be shelled out. Many of these type of beans, the whole pod can be eaten at the younger stages. If you allow them to become fully mature, then you shell them out of the pod and keep just the seeds to eat. You can either dry them fully and keep them as dried beans and then soak them overnight and cook them for eating, or you can eat them fresh as you shell them out when you harvest them. Bean seeds like this also have two types of growing habits. One type is a bush bean that will spread out in a small bush-like form. The other type is pole beans, which will grow long vines. They can grow 6 or 8 feet or even longer, and it's generally the custom when growing pole beans to put in some kind of a structure to grow the beans up. Put in some stakes with a wire or some kind of a trellis framework for the beans to be able to grow on and support themselves. We will plant these beans here with the methods that we would use for bush beans. We've got to make our row first before we can put them in. We want to allow enough room for the squash to grow, and then bush beans can grow out anywhere from 12 to 16 inches. So we'll allow a little additional room for bean growth in bush beans, and then we'll make a row. It's generally good, especially with beans and a lot of the smaller garden vegetable seeds, to use seed that's as fresh as you can get. The older the seed is, the poorer the germination quality will be. And it's possible with some seeds, if they're kept for 6 or 8 or 10 years, that there will be almost no germination. So it's much better to use seed as fresh as possible. If the seed is 1 or 2 years old or a little older, then you can just plant the seed more thickly if you can't get fresh seed. But for your time and your effort, it's better if you have old seed and you're tempted just to use it rather than to buy new seed. It's better to go ahead and buy the new seed and not use the old seed because of the likelihood of poor germination. And if you plant the seeds and you get poor germination and there's just 1 or 2 here and there in long distances where none come up, then that means that you've lost several weeks or at least a week or two, depending on how long it takes them to germinate. And you still will have to go back and plant again. So here we'll plant these as you would if the seeds were fresh seeds. We'll plant them about every 2 to 3 inches apart. And then when they come up, we will thin them out to about 6 to 8 inches apart. Now, depending on how big the growing habit is, different types of bush beans, and the packages will often tell how much room to allow. Different types of bush beans can grow across a bigger space, and if they are pretty vigorous, then you may want to thin them out even more, maybe up to 10 inches or 12 inches apart. But we'll just plant these every 2 or 3 inches. And then we'll just pull over an inch and a half of dirt like we did with the squash seed. It doesn't take any more than that. Then we'll tamp it down with a hoe. Now we've got potatoes, squash, beans. We planted summer squash, that is. There are different varieties of squash as well. There are varieties of what's called winter squash, Hubbard squash, acorn squash, butternut squash. These kinds of squash take longer to grow and mature, and then they have hard shells on them that help to protect and keep them for a longer period of time. The summer squash is much more tender and succulent. The shell on it is very thin, and they are generally eaten soon after being harvested. The winter squash usually grow on a vine rather than in a bush like the summer squash do, a bush type of habit. And the winter squash will grow all season, and the squash are harvested at the end of the growing season, whereas in summer squash is harvested once they start coming on. They'll keep growing more and more squash, and you keep harvesting them as you see them ready, and they will keep bearing for a while as you use them. The winter squash can keep sometimes for several months through the winter when they are grown properly and then harvested in the fall. We just planted summer squash here. You need more space to grow winter squash because they're a vine type. In their growing habit, they can grow 8, 10, 15 feet. So one practice that many people use in growing winter squash is to plant some crop like corn, and then once the corn is starting to grow well, maybe 2 feet high or more, then they'll plant some seeds of winter squash in the cornfield and allow the winter squash to cover over the ground in between the corn plants. So that makes it possible to grow both crops there in the same area and utilize a lot of that space where the corn is not growing, but where the squash can spread out its vines. We'll plant another type of bean here. We planted some bush beans. We'll plant a bean here that is very well known, a bean that's been around for a long time. This is a pole bean called Kentucky Wonder Bean. And they grow a very nice looking bean, as you can see from the picture. They are a very vigorous plant. They produce a lot of beans. There have been times when I have grown Kentucky Wonder Beans, and in about a 12 or 15-foot section of bean row, I could harvest as much as 1 bushel of beans in a picking. We will plant some of these, and we will have to plan when we plant pole beans to be able to string them up. We want to provide some method of supporting them for the vines to grow, because they will be long vines. We have to allow enough room here again. These beans, you'll notice, are a different color than the others. The others were white. You can get beans that have red seeds. The Kentucky Wonder beans here are brown. You can also get beans that have black seeds. Some are speckled, some will be even red and white striped. There's quite a variety of different types of beans available. We'll plant these again about 2 to 3 inches apart. And it doesn't really make any difference whether the eye, you can see a little white spot on the top of the bean, that's the eye. That's where a sprout will start growing and make a root. Some people put the eye facing down, but the bean will grow any way that it's sitting in the ground. The sprout will start growing and the root will grow down, because the sunlight shining down on the soil will help to orient the seed, and the magnetic influences going through the soil from magnetic north and other things such as the movement of moisture in the soil, all of those will influence the growth of the seed, and it will grow with the sprout going the proper way regardless of how the seed is oriented. Now again, we'll just cover this over with about 1 inch of dirt or so. And we'll tamp it down. Another thing we'd like to grow are some carrots. Carrots can be planted pretty early in the season. Usually on the back of seed packets you will find simple instructions such as here, where it will tell you the depth to plant the seeds and how far apart to space rows, and oftentimes it will tell you if you need to wait until after frost. So if you're unfamiliar or you haven't had any experience planting before, there are usually enough instructions to give you an idea to get started, and as you work with them you'll find out more and more different little tips and tricks that will help you to get the best results. Carrot seeds, as you can see, are much smaller than any of the seeds we've worked with so far. They're very, very tiny, so they don't have to be put very deep in the soil, and it's easy to get them too thick with these small seeds. We're going to make a little row and then we'll sprinkle them as thinly as we can, but we'll have to expect to thin them out when they come up. Now, since our last row here was pole beans, we need to leave enough room for their growth. And we'll come over a little ways, start with our carrots. Carrots will not take near as much room as beans will, so some of our next rows can be closer together where we're growing smaller items. One of the things to remember when you're laying out your garden is to plant things that are not as likely to shade other plants in one area, and the plants that are going to grow higher and produce more shade, oftentimes it's better to put them all together in one area since they all grow taller. Another thing that you can do is orient your rows where the sun can shine and get to more of the row where things are higher. So keeping those matters in mind is helpful when organizing where you're going to plant things. We don't want to end up planting, for instance, where the sun's going to be shining a certain direction, planting a row of corn or several rows of corn, and then plant something real low right behind it, so it'd be hard for it to get sun most of the time. We'd plant those short things in front. So here, where we are oriented with the south facing this way, and the sun is usually shining this direction, the way we're running our rows allows the sun to get into most of the rows, even though some of the rows are taller than others. And we'll plant more of our short things out here where they'll get a lot more sunshine as well. Now we're going to start out with these small carrot seeds, and there's several ways we can do this. One way is to just use the package and jiggle the seeds as we go along, and you can see them falling out some. These you'll expect to plant them a lot thicker than what you're going to need, but that's all right because when they come up you can thin them out. And you don't have to use all the seeds that are in a packet. You just use what you need. And if they don't all come up, or if something happens, an animal comes along and digs some of them up or eats the tops off, you can go back and reseed with some of the seeds that are left to fill in. Even though it's a little later, at least you can still take advantage of the soil nutrients you've put on and of the space in the garden, and you can still get things that you can use. They'll just come on a little later. We'll cover over our carrots now with just a little amount of dirt. Doesn't take much. We can't even see the seeds, but by faith we're covering them over. Then we'll tamp that down like we've done with the others. And we'll plant some peas. Now there are several different kinds of peas, just like the beans. Some peas grow with a growing habit that's like the bush type, and then some peas grow with a growing habit like the pole type. These peas that we're going to plant here, we will plant with the bush method. You can see how the peas look. Like the beans, the peas can either be eaten when they're young, tender, and fresh, or they can be allowed to grow until they get fully mature and dry. And then they can be shelled out and kept for use, soaking them and cooking them when they're ready to eat, or they can be kept for seed as well. So we'll plant these just like we did the beans, about every 2 or 3 inches. You can see that we get lots of opportunity to get in contact with the soil. which is good. We were made from the soil. The Bible tells us that man was made from the ground. And when we die, we go back to the soil. And all between when our life begins and when our life ends, we're sustained by the things that come from the soil. So the more direct we have a contact with the soil, the more we find it benefits us physically, spiritually, and mentally. Now there's one other thing that we can do that will actually help in the growing of beans and peas. There is a product that is called soil inoculant. It has nitrogen-fixing bacteria in it. And this is just a powder with a medium, a culture that has been used to grow bacteria that specifically take nitrogen out of the air, and they will attach it to the roots of legume plants. And there are different types of these soil microbes or bacteria that are especially adapted to certain types of legume plants. So you can get inoculant that's especially for peas, that's especially for beans. You can get inoculant that's especially for other legumes such as vetch or clover. Sometimes you can buy an inoculant that is a mixture of different bacteria so that it can cover more of a variety of legumes. Perhaps most of the legumes you might grow in your garden, different varieties of peas and beans. So you can take some of this inoculant, and there are different ways of using it. You can either sprinkle a little of it in the row, like we're going to do here, along with your seed. We'll just sprinkle a little bit out of the end of the container. You can see it's just a dark colored powder. You just sprinkle it in the row. Another method that can be used, and it will tell in the directions, ways that you can do it, is to moisten the seed with some water, then sprinkle an inoculant on the seed, and because they're moist, it will stick to them. And then you can plant the seeds in the ground. But the idea is to get some of that inoculant in with the seeds, and that allows those bacteria to be able to take nitrogen out of the air and to attach it right onto the roots where the plants can use it. Now we're going to pack it down. All right, we're going to plant some peppers next. Some of these plants, such as peppers and tomatoes and eggplant, are more of a tropical type of plant in their origin. They love warm weather. They're very sensitive to cold weather. In fact, some of them do not even grow if it gets below 50 degrees. They're not killed, but they just stop growing. If it does get down to freezing, it is very likely to kill them. These kind of plants can get a head start and take more advantage of the growing season when it's warm by being started indoors in a small flat, a box that's low and maybe 16 inches long and 12 inches wide, or you can use different sizes of containers. Some people even start them just in a little pot or a pan. It's not so important that it be a certain size, but it needs to be something that the soil can stay moist in, but not wet. You don't want it to be saturated. It needs to duplicate as closely as possible the growing conditions that would be outside in good warm summer weather. By planting the seeds in a place like that several weeks before it's warm enough to plant them outside, they can be grown and get up big enough that they can be then transplanted outside as soon as the danger of frost is past. Or they can be planted, such as we're doing here, right directly in the ground, and the crop will come on a little later, as long as your growing season is long enough. The peppers that we have here are California Wonder Peppers. That's the variety. They actually turn red when they are ripe. And on the back we have instructions that tell us that the peppers can be started indoors 8 to 10 weeks before transplant time. They need to be kept warm, and then gradually they can be exposed to cooler temperatures to harden them up as they get closer to transplant time. But of course not to any temperatures that would be liable to freeze them. It takes about 75 days for these plants to mature fruit from the time that they are transplanted. We're going to plant these just directly in the ground here. Pepper plants need room to grow. They don't grow real tall, but they do spread out a little bit. They're, again, a bush type of plant in their growing habit. So we'll allow a couple feet here of room for the pepper plants from our bush peas. If you were observant, you may have noticed that we did not put any inoculant on the beans that we planted. We had put it on the peas. It's not essential to have inoculant on legume seeds in order for them to grow. In fact, if you have put some inoculant on the different types of legumes that you've grown in the past, once the bacteria are there in the soil, as long as you keep growing some of those types of legumes from time to time, those bacteria will keep multiplying, and as you have good healthy soil with plenty of organic matter, those bacteria can flourish and they will be there present whenever you plant those kind of legumes. So it really is only necessary to get those bacteria introduced into the soil, and then they will continue growing from year to year under good conditions. We will plant these pepper seeds, and they look a lot like tomato seeds. If you've eaten peppers or tomatoes, you've seen what the seeds look like. It doesn't take many, but we will plant them about 3 or 4 inches apart, and then we'll thin them out when they come up to about 12 to 14 inches apart. These are the kind of things that it's fun to grow, even if you're in a place where you have no outside ground that you can plant a garden in. You can just take a flower pot and mix up some soil mix with a small quantity of different elements that you can use, and you can plant a few seeds in it and start growing some pepper plants just like you'd grow a flower. It's exciting to be able to grow something that you can actually eat, even right in your window or on your front porch. And you can get some experience seeing what it's going to take to grow when you have the opportunity to have outside soil. And then just takes a small amount of dirt over these seeds. About 1/2 inch is sufficient. I'll tamp it down again. Unless you have a pretty good long growing season, most of the time you will get the best results if you do start these kind of plants in a seed bed in some kind of container indoors, and then transplant them outside after all danger of frost has passed. But for the sake of demonstration, we're showing here what you can do even planting them in the ground. Now the rest of our bed that we have left here, we're going to plant our shortest things on. We have some spinach, some kale. You can plant different types of greens. We also have some radishes and some lettuce. We don't have enough room here in the area that we have been using to plant all the different varieties of things that could be planted. We would like to grow also cucumbers. We could grow several different varieties of squashes. We could grow different varieties of lettuce. You have leaf lettuce, you have bib lettuce, you have oak leaf lettuce, you have red lettuce, you have green lettuce, you have head lettuce. There are also many different varieties of greens. You can grow kale, you can grow collards, you can grow mustard greens. There are other types of things that can be grown. Kohlrabi. We could grow beets. We could grow onions, garlic. The principles of planting them are very similar. Some of them require some special attention to certain things, such as onions. If we are planting onions, generally you can buy or you can grow your own from seed. Small onions, they will be about the size, anywhere from the size of a dime up to the size of a quarter, and they're referred to as onion sets. You can start them from seed, starting them early, just like I described with the peppers, or as you would start tomatoes indoors. And then after they grow up from seed a little while, then you can transplant them outside. Onions need to be planted very shallow. You don't want to plant them deep. Unlike the potatoes, which need to be kept all under the ground, onions do the best if they're about halfway out of the ground. If they are growing right up at the surface of the ground, they will do the best. We didn't have room to plant all of them in here, but the principles will be the same. And a good gardening book, if you get a gardening manual or handbook, will oftentimes give you most of the special things that might be needed for specific types of plants that we didn't cover here. But we will plant some types of greens here. We'll plant some spinach. Spinach is a green that many people like to use both raw and cooked. Even without a gardening manual or instruction book, just using the simple instructions on the back of the seed packets will usually give you pretty good results. And we can make our rows a little closer with these smaller items. We'll leave some room for our peppers that we planted last to grow, and then we'll plant our rows closer after this. So row for spinach. Seeds of spinach and lettuce and things like that will be varying sizes. These seeds are just a little bigger than the carrot seeds were. We can plant these 2 or 3 inches apart. And as I mentioned before, if the seed is not fresh seed from the past season's growing time, if it's more than a year old, then you want to be sure to plant more thickly, because germination oftentimes is not as good. On the back of this growing packet, it says the seed should be spaced to about 4 inches, or the plants should be spaced at least 4 inches apart after they come up. So when the seeds germinate, they could be thinned out now after planting them a couple inches apart or thicker. And we'll plant some kale seed. Kale, you can see, has seeds that are smaller than the spinach. They're small and round. We can make our rows a little closer here with the greens and with the lettuce. We can't even just sprinkle them out of the end of the seed packet. They'll be pretty thick, but we can thin them out. There's several different little methods that people sometimes use with small seeds like this. I've known of people to mix them up with ashes. Just take like a cup full of ashes and put some of the seeds in, mix them up thoroughly, and that way they can sprinkle them down the row and they don't have the seeds as thick, or they can be mixed with sand, something that's not going to be any bigger than the seeds. We'll work with that. Thin out the amount of seeds that gets in the row. Then we'll plant some radishes. Now here, this might be a good place to suggest what can be done in a situation like back here earlier in the row. Let's just go back here to an earlier place in the row where we had real wide spaces. We had planted potatoes, and then we planted squash. And we have quite a bit of space in here, and it's a shame to have this space just sitting here for a while these plants are getting developed. So we could plant something in here that grows very quickly and can be harvested and used while the other things are growing. That way we can take advantage of some of this space. So one thing we could do is to plant something like radishes or lettuce. Radishes and lettuce both will grow up very quickly. They're much faster in growing than the squash and some of those things. So we can plant a little extra in between these rows, and then by the time they start really developing, the squash, the potatoes, and the other things, we'll have already grown this little crop of lettuce and radishes and harvested it. Even some types of greens will grow very quickly, and we could grow a few of them in this extra space. So we'll just do that in here. We'll make a couple of small rows where we could plant lettuce and radishes. Radishes come up very quick. In fact, if you plant something that takes a long time to germinate, sometimes beets or parsnips or other root plants can take much longer to germinate. You can plant a few radishes in with them, and that helps you see where your row is while they're getting germinated and coming up. The radishes will come up way ahead of some of those types of plants. Here we can see the radish seeds look very similar to kale seeds. They're actually similar to broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower. You can't tell the seeds apart on a lot of those plants. They're actually in the same family. But we'll plant some radishes along in this row. They're a little thick, but they can be thinned out to about 2 inches apart once they come up. And we'll put some lettuce. This is a variety of leaf lettuce called salad bowl, and it has both green and red lettuce mixed together in the seeds, so you get a variety that you can use in your salad. These seeds that we're planting here, even this lettuce, are open pollinated, or sometimes referred to as heirloom varieties. That means that when they go to seed, if you leave them in and allow them to grow long enough to go to seed, and then collect the seed, you can plant that seed next growing season and get the same type of plants, same varieties. We just cover these small seeds over with a small amount of soil, enough to cover them, and we'll tamp them down. So now we can get a little crop of radishes and a little crop of lettuce while the potatoes and squash are getting going, and then by the time they start filling out, these things will be done. And you can do that anywhere you have more open spaces while the slower growing things are developing. Now we have a couple more things here we'll plant. We could plant some more lettuce on this end. This type of lettuce is a lettuce is like halfway between a head and leaf lettuce. It's a thicker type of leaf and a deeper green, not quite as light and succulent. This is a variety called Grand Rapids. Looks like I planted lots of seeds in a row. Spread these seeds out in the row here. Bottom opened up on the seed packet and we got more seeds than we needed, but that's all right. We can just spread them out, and when they come up, we'll thin them out to the best looking plants. Now we want to plant some beets. There are several different types of beets that are standard beets for growing and that are open pollinated varieties. The most common and popular variety is Detroit red, dark red beet. This kind that I have here is a cylindrical beet. Rather than being more round like a ball, it's a little more cylindrical shaped. But the growing pattern is pretty much the same and the requirements. The beets are good both for the tops and bottoms to be used, so that's an excellent plant. They're very nutritious. The tops can be used for greens. They're a good source of iron and other nutrients, and then the bottoms also are a very good source of nutrients. Beet seeds are rather unique in that one seed actually can grow several plants. So we will plant a few of these beet seeds. Basically, we can plant one beet seed. We must make our row first. We can plant one beet seed at each place where we want to grow a beet. And we can plant a few in between and then thin them out. Beets don't take near as much room as something like cabbage, peas, or even broccoli. We'll plant these about 2 to 3 inches apart. Whenever they are thinned, about 3 to 4 inches apart works good for beets. And then we'll tamp it down again. Now we have room for one more row of something here, and we'll plant a row of turnips. Turnips are not as much of what you might consider a staple item, but since we just have a little space left, that's one of the seed packets we have, and we can plant a few. Turnips are a good item actually to plant in the latter part of the summer, along in end of July or through the earlier middle part of August, even up to the beginning of September. Turnips can grow into the winter, and they can be harvested and used even after frost and cold weather have set in. Turnip seed are kind of like radish and kale seed, but even much smaller. You can see how small they are. So it doesn't take much to get quite a few in the row. It only takes a little effort to get a pretty liberal sprinkling. And they too can be thinned out to 2 or 3 inches apart when they come up. Or if you want to grow them just largely for greens, you can leave them thicker and just cut the tops as you harvest for greens. Some people grow both with beets and turnips. They will grow them and allow them to grow thicker. Then they'll cut out the ones that they would thin out, and they'll use the tops for greens, and then the ones they leave are the ones that they grow for roots. So there are different ways of doing it depending on what you want to use off of the plant. And that completes our seed planting in this bed. There are several things that we didn't plant in here that I would consider staple items. One was tomatoes, another was sweet corn. We will demonstrate planting and growing some of those in another demonstration here, but we don't have room in this bed with the things we planted. So you can see that you could focus just on some staple items, but we have also planted some additional items in here. Depending on what your room is and how many beds you have, you can organize which things will be most important for you to plant. And you may wish to start out with things that would be easy and quick, and then as you develop confidence and experience, you can keep expanding. Now the last step, after we've planted things, we want to water it, unless it looks like it's going to rain or there's a pretty high likelihood of getting rain by this evening or tonight. We're going to water these seeds so there's moisture both for the microbe activity and for helping the seeds to germinate. They need moisture in order to germinate. A spray wand, like we have here, is ideal for being able to water without having a heavy stream in one place. There are different levels of quality of these available, and it's best to pay a little more and get a good quality one. This one here has the place to screw on to the end of a garden hose on one end, and it has a head that screws easily on and off. The head is a good solid aluminum head and has a portion in the middle where the holes are for the water to come out that's securely fastened in. Some of the spray wands that you get will have a plastic head and a lightweight metal center that can break or come apart easily. So it's better to get one that will hold up for your needs and be of good service for a long time. This particular variety here is Dramm, D-R-A-M-M. So we're going to fasten this on here and turn on the water to water this bed. It's very important to have a water supply available. We have put in a yard hydrant here that enables us to hook right to it and water our beds very conveniently. We can be right here by the bed and we can turn on the water to the amount that we need. It's just a gentle stream. Soaks in good. That will help those seeds to sprout and help the microbes to work. Have to wait till we get the air out of the line. This will also help some of the plant food amendments that we put on to start dissolving and become available as the seeds germinate and the roots start growing. We'll just go quickly back over it and soak a little more water in. So that completes our preparation, planting, and watering of this seed bed. And now we're ready to trust in the Lord to do His part to help the seed to germinate, and it will be exciting to see when the plants start coming through the ground. We talked about how to plant seeds in your bed or in your garden and the different types of seeds. We also talked about starting some plants earlier from seeds indoors. If you either start some plants indoors or if you buy some plants from a nursery or a greenhouse that have been started indoors and you're going to prepare to plant them in your bed or your garden, then you will want to be able to use the proper techniques for transplanting them and get the best success. So we're going to demonstrate here the mix that will give you a good transplanting solution you can use to water those plants as you transplant. And we'll demonstrate transplanting a tomato plant. The technique is pretty much similar whether it's peppers, tomatoes, cabbage, or other types of plants. This solution can even be used for transplanting fruit trees and bushes, blueberries, strawberries, apple trees, other things like that. You will find a more detailed list of ingredients you can use in some of the different areas of transplanting and feeding plants in the book Nourishment Homegrown. We have some of those formulas listed in the resource sections. There are several major ingredients that we want to be sure to include in the transplant solution. Water, of course, is the main ingredient because we're supplying moisture, which the plants need very much when they are transplanted. We're also going to be using blackstrap molasses, some rock phosphate, and also some kelp liquid. If we have it available, we use some calcium nitrate, and there are some other things that you can use if they're available, but those are the main things you want to be sure to be able to put in, even if you can't get other things that are used in minute quantities. So we're going to mix up a little solution here that we can use for transplanting. We'll get a can, and I have here some water to which molasses has already been added. If you are just starting out with water and you have some feed-grade blackstrap molasses, then you would have mostly water and you can add a little bit of blackstrap molasses. We will mix up about a gallon of water and 1 or 2 tablespoons, anywhere from 1 to 2 tablespoons to 1/4 of a cup of blackstrap molasses is an ample amount. Then we'll use about 1 tablespoon of kelp liquid, and we'll use just a few grains of calcium nitrate, and we'll mix that up well. And also we'll put in some rock phosphate. The rock phosphate that we're going to use is Tennessee brown rock phosphate. There are several different varieties of rock phosphate available. Some of it is colloidal phosphate with clay or labeled in different ways, and you can use it all similarly. So we'll put some water in our gallon can here, and this has already had some molasses mixed in with it. We'll put just a little bit of kelp liquid. I'm going to estimate about a tablespoon or so. Doesn't take much. And then we'll get a little of the brown rock phosphate. We'll put about a handful in for a gallon of water. The phosphate is very important in a transplant solution because it encourages good root growth on the plants. It really helps to stimulate the growth of the plants. Now we're going to take this transplant solution. We'll want to stir it up a little bit, but we're going to prepare a place to put a tomato plant. As I mentioned, we want to stir this up well. One way that we can do that is by pouring it back and forth from one container to another. As you can see, the phosphate will tend to settle to the bottom, which means that we have to agitate or stir it up just when we're ready to pour some out for transplanting, to get as much of that stirred in as we can. Of course, we could stir it with a stick too. So now we've stirred this up some. We have a tomato plant here that we've dug up. We're going to make a little hole here beside where we have some other tomato plants. Those were transplanted last week or about a week ago. Now we'll fix up our hole here. And set our tomato plant in slightly lower than where it was when we took it out. We'll stir up some of this water again. And we'll water the plant thoroughly with it. Now we can put the dirt back in around it. We didn't add calcium nitrate in this particular solution here, but if we had had that there to add in, we'd have just put in just a little bit, like a couple pinches with our fingers for a gallon can. But the main things are provided if you can put the kelp liquid, the molasses, and the rock phosphate. And then if you have the other things, you can use them, even as I was mentioning, it's described in the formulas, which we provide in the resource or the section at the end of the DVD, or in the booklet Nourishment Homegrown by Alexander Badeau, which we also refer to. We want to take a look at what some of the plants are going to look like that we've planted. Here in this bed and in another bed we have some of the young plants that are just coming up, and you will see how they look. Some of the plants have leaves that appear when they first come up that are not what are called true leaves. They're not permanent leaves. They're just the initial introductory leaves that first show when the seedling comes through the ground. And then the true leaves start developing on the plant. So you want to learn to recognize those as the seeds germinate and come up through the ground, so that when you weed, you don't pull up the plants that you want to keep, and you can know which ones you're wanting to keep. Here in this bed, you can see what young tomato plants look like. This is a tomato plant right here. Pepper plants will look somewhat similar when they come up. They're in the same family. And we have here the first two leaves are the long narrow ones coming out each side, and then the true leaves are the ones that are showing up here closer to the middle. As the plant keeps growing and developing, it will begin looking like this. We have more true leaves developing. Here we still have the first leaves that came up. And as it keeps growing and getting taller, there will be more and more leaves that look like these leaves here, the true leaves. Now over here we have a young potato plant as it first is coming up. We'll hoe a few of these weeds around it or rake up the ground with this little hand fork. This is the way a potato plant looks when it first comes up, and then as it gets bigger it will begin looking like this. That will help you recognize your potato plants. And then all these other little plants around are the weeds that we want to get rid of. And they're much easier to get rid of when they're real small like this. A little stirring of the ground and cultivating, pulling out any that seem to have long roots still stuck in the ground will help to get rid of them. If the sun shines on this for a few hours and dries the ground out after we've stirred it up with these little weeds, most of them will just wilt and die. Now after the potatoes get just a little taller than this, when they're up 6 or 8 inches tall, then it's possible to come through with a hoe and hoe the dirt up around them a little bit. Just like this. And after another week or two, when more of the little weeds sprout, we can come through and hoe again and hoe dirt up. The plants will be up another 6 or 8 inches or taller. They'll grow pretty fast at this stage if the weather warms up some. And we can hoe some dirt up again. And then later we can collect grass clippings or old hay or something we can use as mulch and put that along and pull it right up under the leaves next to the stalks of the plants. And that will basically crowd out and cover over any weeds that might try to grow, and the potatoes will really do nicely. Now we want to take a look at some of the other seedlings as they're emerging and see what they look like. We're going to start in with some of the seedlings that are coming up here at the end of this bed. It's pretty easy to see where the plants are coming up in a row. We also have some weeds. It happened that there was a tomato vine that left some tomatoes that had rotted here in this area, so we even have some tomato seeds that sprouted and are coming up. You can recognize these little tomato plants, but we don't want to grow tomatoes here, so we're going to take them out. We want to try to keep things clean and allow the plants that we have planted here to be the ones to utilize the nutrition available as much as possible. We'll hoe in between here. With this little fork and try to uproot and loosen some of these little weeds. They'll dry up and wither away. These two rows that we have coming up here are turnips. This is what your turnips will look like. Most of the plants in the cole family, which includes cabbage and broccoli, cauliflower, kohlrabi, turnips, radishes, kale, collards, most all of those plants look very similar when they come up. There's a little bit of difference in some of them. But the first leaves that come up, which are not the true leaves, but are the first leaves, will look like this. This is a small version here. And then we have over here one that's a little larger. You can see how there's two leaves when it first comes up that look like this. And on all these plants, here again, you see the first leaves that have appeared are these leaves that look a little bit heart-shaped. Then the true leaves start growing as the plant keeps developing. And we can see the true leaves here, the bigger ones. Now, as we mentioned in the part where we were planting the seeds, we plant a little thicker than we expect to end up with when we're growing through the season, and we're expecting to thin them out some. So we're going to do that here as well. We want to pick the plants that look big and healthy as nearly as possible, that are spaced out, and pull the other ones out. So here we have a pretty good sized plant, and we have some right close by, a little smaller. We're going to pull them out. We want to leave a turnip plant about every 3 or 4 inches. We have some here. We'll try to thin them out. Here we have a space without many, except one little one. What we may do is leave 2 that are a little closer together than we want. Or we could leave this smaller one, but it looks kind of weak, so I'm going to pull it out and just leave these 2. They can grow toward this space some. Then we have one here. Looks like we're pulling a lot of them out, but as they have the room to grow, they will fill this space out very quickly. Turnips can grow to be 4 or 5 inches or even bigger in diameter if you let them grow long enough and if the season lasts long enough. Here we have one that's a bigger one in between 2 that are spaced more where we want them. So we'll probably just pull this bigger one out so we can keep better spacing. And here on this next row, we'll thin it as well. You can see in some places the plants are pretty thick. It's very important to thin them so that they can have the room to grow and the nutrients they need. Thin the rest of these out here, and that will complete the row then. These little garden forks are very handy and can help you work quickly if the weeds are pretty small. If you let them grow till they're up 2 or 3 inches tall, the roots have also grown down quite a ways. And even if you pull the tops off, a lot of times the roots are well established sufficiently so that it will just grow a sprout out and start growing back. But when they're at this stage of development, they're so small that just a little bit of stirring the ground will uproot the whole weed, and the ground surface will dry out from the sun shining on it for just a little while, and the roots dry up and the plant withers and dies. It's much easier to keep things weeded working when the weeds are at a very small stage. It's the same with habits in our lives. If we allow a habit that's not a desirable habit to start getting developed and take root, the longer it's there, the harder it is to get it eliminated. It's better to nip those kind of habits right in the bud before they can develop and take much root. I like to think about the parallels in working with the soil and working with our hearts. Our hearts are like a type of soil, and we can be developing the kind of fruit that will be pleasing and helpful and serve a good need. One of the important things that we see so much in nature is that many things are performing a service. And that's the way we want to be in our lives also. We want to be doing service to meet the needs of people around us. These plants are doing a service in more ways than one. One of the things that they're doing a service in is they are taking carbon dioxide and other things from the air. They're taking sunshine, but then they're using those to make leaves and to put off oxygen and to grow the plant. So in our bodies, as we breathe, we are producing wastes and breathing out carbon dioxide. And then the plants are taking that carbon dioxide in, and they are transforming the carbons into things in their tissues that they can use for nutrition. And in the process, they're putting oxygen back out in the air, and then we have that oxygen to use. They also are providing things that we can eat. The fruits and the vegetables that grow are a service to man that the plants are performing. So we want to learn the lessons of service as we work in the garden. Here we have some tomato plants that have grown up now for several weeks, and you can see how the true leaves have been forming and developing and have grown into branches as the tomatoes are growing. You can see them growing up. Many times when you transplant a plant, there will be some shock of that plant, just as this tomato that we just planted. It is wilted over some, but the watering that we gave it will be quite a boost to it, and as through the next several days it starts getting established, it will perk up and grow, and it will hardly be noticeable that it ever went through any shock in getting it transplanted. Now let's take a look at several of the other plants that we have in here so we can see how they look when they're small and coming up. Most of the plants that we have through this area right here are going to look very similar to the turnips we had at the end, because they are in the same family, broccoli and kohlrabi and some other things like that. Here we have a rather unique plant with long, slender leaves as the first ones that appear when it germinates and comes out of the ground, and then the true leaves are more round. This is spinach. The spinach will have these long, narrow leaves when it first comes up, and they're pretty easy to distinguish from the little types of grass and weeds that might come up in the bed. We have a couple rows of spinach here, and we can clean out around it a little bit. And if it's too thick, we can thin it. Sometimes even if you plant the seeds reasonably thick, there may be some places where germination is not as good and you'll have a longer space. If you have more seeds and it's not too late in the season, you can plant in those longer spaces and just have several stages of the spinach or the plants that you're growing, developing. Now next to the spinach here we have something else growing. It also is fairly easy to identify. It has a telltale red tinge in it. These are beets. This is the way the beets look when they first come up, and these are the first leaves. The next leaves that grow look a lot like the first leaves. The true leaves look similar, but you can see how the beets look, and they have the telltale red hue, which makes it very easy to identify them. We want to keep weeding and cleaning out around them so they can have more room to fill out and get nutrients. Sometimes people will notice after cultivating a little bit that the plants really seem to make a spurt of growth. You may have noticed as I'm working here with the little garden fork, there's almost kind of a crust on top of the ground. After it rains several times, the little crust can form on the top of the ground, and when you're working it will start breaking up. But as you break that little crust and open up the soil down an inch or two, you're actually putting air. You're opening up the ground to get more air in again. And when the air can get in there, the microbes get a new spurt of activity with the additional oxygen available. And as the microbes work, they break down some of the minerals and elements in the soil and make them available for the plants. So you can see a spurt of growth oftentimes in a field or in a crop where you do some cultivation after you've had some hard rains that have crusted the soil over on top. When you are fixing a bed, it's nice to have a bed that you can work in from one or both sides. 4 feet is about the maximum amount that you can really work in comfortably. As you can see in this bed, it's not hard to reach to the middle from one side, and then it's easy to go around and work from the other side. Some people make beds even in a narrower dimension, maybe about 1.5 feet. About 18 inches wide. It's very easy to work that kind of a bed just from one side. Here we see some of the beets that are growing pretty well. They need thinning. If you're growing the beets primarily to get greens from, or to get greens from initially for a little while, you can leave them growing thicker and then cut off the ones you want for greens and thin them that way. Just leave the ones that are in the right places to grow for the root growth. We'll go ahead and thin these out for root growth. Here we have one of the fastest growing of the little plants that you can grow in your garden. As you can see, these have growing about as fast as any of the plants that are just coming up in this little bed. They will grow pretty rapidly and form little roots that you can eat. You can put them in your salad. These are radishes. You can see how the bottom of the stem is bright red, and the radish will form just down under the surface of the ground. And when they get to be about the size, a little bigger than the size of a quarter, they're just at a good stage to pull up and eat. We can leave these pretty thick and then just thin them by pulling them up and eating them as they are growing. Now down here on this end of the bed, or this part of the bed, we have some carrots that are coming up. Here you can see the carrots. The first leaves are very slender, and they're also long. The true leaves will appear in the middle as they grow, and they actually are more like a fern type leaf than a regular leaf. But you can see the little carrots coming up here in many places. We also want to thin them out. Some of them are so small it may be a little difficult, and we may have to come back a little later to thin them out adequately, but about 2 inches apart would be fine. Just pinch off the ones you don't need. Here's the way the carrots will look after they get bigger. These are some older carrot plants that have been growing a little longer. As the new leaves form, the true leaves, and start developing, they will develop on long stems like this. You can see the fern type appearance of the carrot. These are carrots that are further along, and they will keep growing. They can grow on into even the winter if they're mulched a little bit with some leaves or old hay between them, enough to keep the ground from freezing. They can survive for quite a while in fairly cold weather. And if they have been planted early enough in the year, anytime through the latter part of the summer, mid to latter part of the summer, from July on, you can plant carrot seeds and they will grow up and develop their carrots, and then they can even still do some growing after frost takes place, but they will survive well and can hold up. You can just go out and lift up the mulch and pull up some carrots and have fresh carrots even when you have snow on the ground. Here we have a stray plant that's growing. It looks like it might be a cucumber or a cantaloupe of some kind. This is the way the plants will look if you plant cucumbers, squash, and cantaloupe. The first leaves will be round like that, and then the true leaves will start developing that look a little different. Over here is one that's a little further progressed. These have come up from stray seeds, but even though they're volunteer plants, it's a good illustration of what to look for if you've planted some melon-type seeds, cucumbers, watermelon, cantaloupes. Most all of them have this kind of leaf when they first come up, and then they will start developing true leaves. The leaves may vary that are the true leaves depending on what it is. Watermelon leaves have more of a broken design around the contour of the leaf. The cantaloupe and cucumber leaves are more solid. That will help you to identify some of those plants. We don't have bean plants and corn plants to show you what they will look like, but we can furnish pictures of them in the resource section so you can see what they will look like when they first come up. Sometimes it's easy to confuse corn plants with grass that's growing. Some of the grass growing in this bed here has an appearance that's a little bit like corn. You can see these grass blades here with a long slender blade coming up in the middle and then the wider blade sticking out. Corn is somewhat similar, but there is enough difference that you can distinguish and pull up the grass so that your corn will have more opportunity to grow and use the nutrients it needs. So that gives us an idea of what the plants are going to look like as they're growing. One more that we can show here. These are the way that the cabbage plants and also broccoli and cauliflower will look as they get bigger. We've seen what those kind of plants look like when they first come up. Then as they grow, we can see here what the leaves look like as they grow bigger and fill out. I'll demonstrate just a couple other tools that can be used for your work as you're cultivating and getting the weeds out in the bed. One tool that's useful is like a bigger version of the little hand garden fork. You can see the curved tines on the end. This has a longer handle like a shovel or hoe handle. A tool like this makes it easy to reach all the way across the bed and rake through the ground, loosening it up and pulling up weeds and roots. Then another tool that you can get looks almost like a stirrup in a horse saddle. It has a flat section on the bottom and it's just a oval shaped tool with a handle on it. But this is like a blade that will work both ways. You can just run it back and forth in the soil and it'll go right along under the surface and loosen up the soil as well as pull up little weeds and break off roots. It goes real fast, as you can see. In a larger section or row, you can just work along and really go at quite a clip down the row. After cultivating it, it looks much better, seeing the little weeds out and seeing the contrast to the plants that are growing with the darkness of the soil. And of course, after finishing up on one side of the bed, we'll want to go around and finish up from the other side until it's all done. When you're growing things that need to be able to climb up strings or poles or some kind of a trellis work, then being able to construct a frame or have some type of a cage that can be used will be very helpful. Here we're going to demonstrate how you would be able to make a simple frame that you can tie up tomatoes and support them and be able to keep the fruit from being down on the ground. That's one of the main reasons for being able to trellis something and enable it to be up in the air. Beans, cucumbers, tomatoes, these are examples of of different types of garden vegetables that would be conducive to being trained up a trellis or climbing network. We're going to fix some pieces of wood that we can use to form our support system. We have here just some scraps of wood. You can use pieces of pipe or anything that will be sturdy and able to hold up some weight. We're going to cut these long enough to be able to drive them in the ground to make them sturdy, and then we want them to be able to be up about 5 feet tall. So we want them to be at least 6 feet tall so we can drive them in the ground a foot or so, or even a little taller. So we'll just cut this a little bit and we'll make both of our stakes the same length. A bow saw like this can be purchased from most hardware stores or building supply stores. They come in different sizes. You can get a smaller one, and not only can you purchase the bow saw, but you can also get extra blades. With a little experience and expertise, you can get the right kind of files and things to be able to sharpen the blades and keep them sharp when they get dull as well. But this is very handy, especially just for simple jobs that you can do by hand. Now we want to also make a little point on the end if there's a likelihood it might be a little hard to drive them into the ground. Now we have our 2 stakes with point on the end, and we have the tops fairly flat and even. We'll put one of these on this end. I'll put one on this end. Then we'll put a piece across the top. As I mentioned, there are many ways of fixing up a support system. This is a very simple way with little strips and scraps of wood. You can use pieces of metal pipe, electric conduit that's metal. You could even use plastic PVC pipe if it's a short distance or if you have enough support in the piping system that you're using. But you can use a lot of ingenuity and come up with different ways. A heavier stake can be used. Here in our area we have locust trees that we can split and make stakes such as would be used in a barbed wire fence. And for longer rows of tomatoes or beans, we will put those kind of stakes in, sharpen the point on them with a chainsaw or an axe, and then drive them in with a 10 or 12-pound sledgehammer. And we can put those about every 10 or 12 feet down the row, put in an end post on the end with a post hole digger that we use to dig the hole, which we'll demonstrate a little later. And we can then put a wire along the top and staple it on all the way from one end of the row to the other. Then the method of stringing them up will be the same whether it's in a row like that or in a small trellis framework like this. To string them up, we will use these strings that have come from bales of hay. If there are farmers around in your area that put up baled hay, you can oftentimes get these strings from them where they have been feeding their hay to the cattle and they take the bales apart. If you can't find anybody that has old baling strings from baled hay, you can buy twine at a farm supply or hardware shop and use that. It's preferable to use string that will decompose rather than something like nylon string or some type of plastic twine, because those end up being hard to gather back up and they don't decompose in the soil. So something that will rot and decompose after you've used it a year is much more convenient. You don't have to worry about trying to gather them all back up and untangle them from the vines or weeds or other things. Now there are many ways. If the baling strings have not been cut, you can use a pocket knife, you can use scissors or any kind of a cutting utensil. Here's a quick way. If you just have an edge on something that's metal and then you have a hammer, that's an easy way to cut the string. So you can use whatever's at hand. Now we're going to tie this string along the bottom. There are two ways of doing this. We can tie a string along the bottom, such as I'm doing here, or we can just eliminate the string on the bottom and still put in vertical strings to support the tomato plants. But this is the way that I like to do it here. Now we're going to tie the vertical string for supporting the plant just with a simple loop on the bottom. And then we'll tie it on the top, and we want to allow just a little slack. If we pull it up snug, every string we tie is going to keep pulling the bottom string up more. So we leave a little slack, and then we just tie a very simple loop here as well that's easy to pull apart. We have a bow on the top, and we can just pull this when we want to come along and untie, and it makes it very easy to retie and allow enough string for the growing vine where it may be needed. If you are growing string beans, then you can put the strings about 6 inches apart just uniformly all the way along, and the string beans will naturally climb up the strings. Beans that are the runner type. Tomato vines and also cucumber vines do not naturally climb a string such as pole beans or string beans will. So we need to come back along and train them up the vines, and it's best to do that about once a week with cucumbers and tomatoes. You can notice how all of these strings have a little bit of slack on them, so that avoids as much likelihood of pulling the string up as high on the bottom. And here's what we want to do as we come back now. Each week we'll just loosen this loop on the top. Then we want to run the string around the vine, however much growth has taken place since the previous time that we strung it up. Just loosely, not real tight. And then we'll retie this string again up at the top. When the plant is small, it will be possible to leave the string fairly loose like this. As the plant grows, and especially as tomatoes start forming, they of course are going to develop weight. And as more and more tomatoes develop, the weight of the plant will pull more and more, so your string will not look loose anymore. Even though you may allow some slack as you're tying it up, you're going to have to support the weight of that tomato when you pull the string. So you want to evaluate where you're supporting the tomato but not pulling hard on it. And then hold your string right there, and as you tie again, you can keep it in that place while you're holding the string and pull the loop tight, and then the string will help to support the tomato. This allows air to go through. It allows the sun to shine on the plant. It really helps to diminish the amount of likelihood of disease developing quickly on the plant. It keeps the tomatoes off of the ground so they don't rot as easily. It also makes it harder for animals such as turtles who love to eat tomatoes to reach them, unless they're the first tomatoes at the very bottom. So beans, tomatoes, cucumbers, these are the kind of things that are very well adapted to training up a string or a trellis work. As the tomatoes grow, then we will be able to string them up. We can spray them with foliar spray or prune them as well. I want to show what is necessary to prune when stringing tomatoes like this especially. It helps to put more of the energy of the plant into the production of fruit with the necessary foliage, but not more than is needed. If the tomatoes are not pruned, the plants are not pruned, then the tomato will keep expanding more and more and putting lots of its energy into foliage production. And you may have more number of fruit ultimately, but the fruit will be smaller. If you want to get the maximum number of larger fruits and the most energy into the fruits that you grow, then pruning the tomatoes is important. And when we're pruning the tomatoes, what we're pruning out is what's called a sucker. If you look closely at a tomato plant, you will notice there's a branch that will grow out from the main stalk of the tomato plant. And between the branch and the stem or stalk, there will be a little sucker that comes out right in the middle. And you want to pinch those off when they're just very small. If they are allowed to grow, they will grow rapidly and they will become like another stalk of the tomato till it has many, many stalks growing and grows in many directions. But by pinching these little suckers out, but leaving only the tip that's growing at the top, you want to be sure not to pinch that off. Don't mistake that for a sucker. Now let's go to this plant. Here we have a little branch that has withered up. We can take that off and discard it. Here we have a very small sucker. You can see the sucker. Here's the branch of leaves. Here's the tomato stalk. There's a little sucker coming out right here. Very small, but it's easy to pinch it off now, and then more of the energy will go into the plant and into blossoms that will develop and into the fruit that is produced. Now here's another sucker. This one here is much bigger. We'll pinch that off. And now we're leaving the growing tip. We want to be sure not to pinch the growing tip off. And as the plant grows, we can keep winding the string around the stem and support the plant that way. Here we have a growing, or a sucker that barely can be seen. It's so small. Just a little tip, and we can pinch it off at that stage even. If we come back and do that every week, that will allow the most energy to go into the growth of the plant. Here we have little blossom buds that are just starting to form, and this will help send more energy into those blossom buds rather than into trying to expand the foliage of the plant in the suckers. Now there is an exception to this pruning practice that I described, and that is if the tomato variety is what's called a determinate variety. There are two types of tomato growing habits in the varieties of tomatoes. One type is called determinate. The other kind is called indeterminate. The tomatoes that we're illustrating with here are indeterminate. Indeterminate means that it has a growing tip that will just keep growing as long as the conditions are conducive to growth. The determinate type of tomatoes will grow a little ways and then there's no more growing tip. It's important to leave a sucker or two to form the new growing tip, and it will grow a little ways and then it will do what tomato growers call topping out. That means that the top quits growing and there's no growing tip. So it's important to determine whether you have the determinate variety or the indeterminate variety of tomatoes when you are stringing them up this way. I favor the indeterminate type of tomatoes because they can grow much taller than they can be trained with a string this way. The determinate varieties of tomatoes must be grown more with a caging network of trellis because they do not grow as tall, and it's not conducive to train them up a string like this. If you do grow a determinate variety of tomatoes, then the best thing to do is to put in stakes that are about 3 feet tall and run your strings horizontally rather than vertically. Just every 6 inches or so, you can keep tying strings back and forth to hold the tomatoes in. But you must be sure to allow 1 or 2 suckers to grow out before the plant tops out or the growing tip is not there anymore. There's more than one way to string up or stake tomatoes for supporting them so they're not down on the ground. Stringing up or staking tomatoes enables them to not be as likely to rot on the bottom from being close to moisture. We have here in this bed one way of stringing them up. We've strung them up just using strings on the bottom. Then another way of stringing them up, if there's no strings, is to use a stake, put it in close to each tomato plant, put it in deep enough to provide stable support, and then just use baling string or narrow strips of cloth, pieces of rag, and loosely tie the plant over close to the stake. And do this periodically, probably once a week would be adequate, and just keep tying it close to the stake as it grows up, using the proper pruning and training techniques. Another method that some people favor, a wire cage, and they come in different sizes, varieties, and styles, but here's one example. And when the plant is small, it's possible to put the cage right over the plant very easily and fasten the wire cage down in the ground. This is a style of support that people who use the determinate type of tomatoes oftentimes like to use, because they grow up about 2 to 3 feet tall, such as the size of this wire cage, and they bush out a little more. They don't grow with a growing tip continuously like the indeterminate variety of tomatoes. So these are 3 different methods of trellising or supporting tomatoes to keep them off the ground, make them easier to pick, helps to let the air go through the plants and diminish the likelihood of disease and funguses.